Americans love to argue about politics. Americans have been arguing since the first arrivals appeared on the shores of Virginia and Massachusetts in the early 1600s. In the 19th century, in the late 19th century, the topic they loved to argue about the most was the topic of money. And it's not just, I want more of it. They were arguing about what constitutes money. What is money? What are we going to accept in exchange for goods that we sell you? What are we going to accept in exchange for debts and for the payment of debts? What is money, and who's going to determine what constitutes money? Who's going to determine the value of money? Where does this authority lie? Where does it come from? What should a good monetary policy include? What should it consist of? Americans had been arguing about money since colonial days, since Americans were subject of the British Crown. Now, as subjects of the British Crown, they were dictated to by British monetary policy. And this created a problem because the policy of the British government, the policy toward the colonies, was that the colonies were supposed to be cash cows for the British government. The colonies were supposed to provide money, gold and silver, for the good of Britain, England, Britain as a whole. Not for the good of the colonies, but for the good of the British government in particular. And so the British colonial government was always trying to figure out ways of extracting money from the colonies. And again, money in those days meant gold and silver. So, gold and silver. Gold has been the predominant form of money for centuries, probably millennia. What's the advantage of gold? Well, the advantage of gold is it's pretty, for one thing. People like to look at it, so not only do they use it for money, but they put it in their earrings, and they put it in their noses, and they put it around their wrists, and they like the looks of it. Secondly, gold is really resistant to reaction. Gold doesn't react chemically. Gold is about as inert as things come. So whereas if money were made of, say, steel or iron, if our pennies were made of iron and our quarters were made of steel, and we left them out in the rain long enough, they would rust and just go away. They would no longer exist. Gold doesn't do that. Gold you can leave out in the rain forever. You can sink gold coins under the ocean and leave them there for 2,000 years and go back and pick them up and they're as shiny as ever. So gold has the advantage of that it's really durable. In fact, it's not much of an exaggeration to say that all the gold that has ever been dug out of the ground in all the millennia that humans have been attracted to gold, to try to acquire gold, is still around in the form of gold. And so if a gold coin was made by Julius Caesar's government of Rome, it's still there, unless somebody actually melted it down into something else, but it doesn't go away. So that's a big advantage of gold. But probably the greatest advantage of gold is that it's scarce and non-reproducible. In fact, if it were reproducible, it wouldn't remain scarce for very long, but it's scarce, which means that it has a value. There's a fundamental principle of economics that scarcity implies a greater value. So if things are scarce, then they're valuable, and gold and money is supposed to be valuable. You don't want money to be something that everybody has lots of. I mean, people want lots of money, but what they really want is the value of the money. So gold has these attributes. And I guess maybe one of the most important things is that it's non-reproducible, which means that governments can't just crank out more gold coins. No, you have to mine the stuff out of the ground. And in that sense, for people who have this kind of religious bent of their mind, God is the one who makes gold money. Nobody else gets to do it. Anyway, so gold was the money that everybody wanted. Gold was the money that the British government wanted. Gold was the money that people in the colonies wanted, but because the British government made the laws, the money kept flowing out of the colonies to London, the British capital, and came back rarely and only with great effort. The result of this was that the colonies were chronically short of money. They would accept silver Silver is not as rare as gold. It's not as durable as gold. Silver will react with other things. And so silver isn't as valuable as gold. It's a second choice when it comes to money. But it works. So we have silver coins, quarters, dimes, nickels. Now these days they're silver plated. They're not solid silver. They used to be solid silver. But anyway, so silver was a secondary substitute. But when you didn't have enough gold, when you didn't have enough silver, so actually what the colonists did was they began using money that had been minted by the Spanish government. Spain controlled all the Central and South American colonies, and there was lots of silver coinage circulating in those colonies and finding its way into the English colonies in North America. So Americans got used to the idea of using Spanish silver dollars as a unit of currency. And one of the things that this points out is money is whatever people are willing to accept as money. If you owe me $20 and you say, okay, I'll pay you $20 if you give me $20 in a $20 bill, I take it, okay? But if you don't have a $20 bill, maybe you say, hey, I've got this jumbo-sized pizza I know that you like. It's costs $20. Will you take this in exchange for the debt that I owe you? And if I say, yeah, well, then the pizza effectively is money. Or maybe you say, I'll give you a ticket to an upcoming volleyball game. And it's right in front, it's a $20 ticket. So, okay. So money is whatever people are willing to accept as money. And when gold and silver are not available, people in the American colonies, for example, were driven to, they would make money of their own. They would write out IOUs. Promissory notes is the fancy name for them. But IOUs would just say, I will pay you $10, whenever I get the money. And if you're willing to accept it, then you will. Now, why would you be willing to accept it? Maybe you're selling a horse or a mule for $10, and the person who wants to buy it doesn't have $10 in gold. But you think that this person is reliable, so you'll accept the IOU. Now, one step up from IOUs are printed paper money. The British colonial government frowned upon the issuing by the colonies of paper money. And for the most part, the colonies weren't allowed to do it. But it was something that they were tempted to do because there wasn't enough gold, there wasn't enough silver to go around. Now, what do I mean to go around? Well, people simply didn't have money in their pockets, and so it was really hard to conduct business without money. As I said, so people will come up with substitutes. 1776, the colonies declare independence. The United States of America is now in business. And for a brief period, from 1776 until 1789, when the new Constitution went into effect, the states, the Declaration of Independence created not exactly a United States of America. It's really more on states than united. It created something that would be governed by the Articles of Confederation, in which each of the 13 states was an independent country. And one of the things these independent countries did was do what independent countries do and issue money. And they would print notes, and they say, okay, this is $1 from Connecticut, this is $1 from New York, whatever. The trouble with this was very much like, the trouble, I'll use that term, in Europe before the creation of the Eurozone. In Europe, you had people in France doing business with people in Germany. And in France, the unit of currency was the franc. In Germany, the unit of currency was the Deutschmark. And if you're going to do business across the borders, you have to convert currency from one to the other, and sometimes back and forth when you cross the border twice. And it's a real pain in the neck, and there's a cost of the exchange, and it simply makes business harder to conduct. So one of the first things that the new Constitution of the United States did was to forbid the states from issuing their own currency. Only the Congress of the United States, not the legislature of any state, only the Congress of the United States could issue money. And that money took the form of coined money, gold and silver. So this is what the Constitution says. The states are out of the business of issuing money. It meant that in the United States, in effect, as of 1789, when the Constitution went into effect, had its own Eurozone. It was the dollar zone. And this, by the way, is one of the secrets of America's economic success over the years. The United States has had this large single market. In fact, until the creation of the European Community in the Eurozone, the United States had the largest single market in the world. And arguably, it may be bigger than the Eurozone, and especially with Britain pulling out of the EU, it never was in the Eurozone. It's a kind of a technicality here. But anyway, so the United States had this large market where there was one currency. The one currency was the US dollar. But what did a dollar consist of? A dollar consisted of, well, what Congress said was X ounces of gold, and it varied over time. It got so that it took fewer and fewer ounces of gold to make a dollar, so that an ounce would be worth more as time went on. But anyway, Congress fixed the amount it took X ounces for a dollar. And then silver was added on. Silver was defined as it's basically worth a 10th or a 15th or a 20th of the comparable amount of gold. So gold and silver were the currency of the United States from 1789 until the 1860s. But the fact that it was just gold and silver meant that the people in the United States, Americans, the states of the United States, ran into the same problem that colonists ran into in the British Empire. In many places, there wasn't enough money, gold, there wasn't enough gold and silver to go around. And oftentimes, people didn't want to carry gold and silver in their pockets. It got heavier. Or for small transactions, it's really a pain in the neck. It takes a tiny amount of gold to buy a loaf of bread or a newspaper, something like that. So you need smaller units than that. And there were smaller coins that were created. But the fact of the matter was there still wasn't enough gold and silver. And the problem there is, as I mentioned before, only God can make gold. And if God's not making much gold these days, more precisely, if people aren't discovering gold and they're not digging it out of the ground fast enough, then the growth in the money supply can't keep up with the growth in the overall economy. And whenever that happens, when the economy grows faster than the money supply, then that means that prices fall. So imagine an island economy where the currency consists of consists of sand dollars, and the only products that anybody wants to buy and sell on the islands are coconuts. And let's imagine that you have 100 sand dollars and 100 coconuts. Well, the average price of a coconut is going to be $1 sand dollar. Now let's suppose that the economy grows, and next year there are 200 coconuts. Let's suppose you still have only 100 sand dollars, and you have to take 100 sand dollars and spread them over 200 coconuts, so each coconut averages 50 cents, or half of a dollar. So prices fall if the money supply doesn't increase at the same speed as the overall economy. And falling prices, just like rising prices, create some problems. The ideal is stable prices, so people know that if a loaf of bread costs 50 cents today, it'll cost 50 cents next year, and something close to that. So Americans did what the British government had prevented the colonists from doing, that is to use paper money. Now, the states were forbidden from issuing money, but private entities could issue money, and those private entities, in fact, were banks. And banks would issue bank notes. Now, bank note is essentially an IOU on the bank. And the note says, the Bank of Pennsylvania will pay to the bearer $10 upon the delivery of this note. And so if you're selling a mule in Philadelphia and your customer doesn't have $10 in gold, but the customer does have a $10 note drawn on the Bank of Philadelphia, Bank of Pennsylvania, then you say, all right, okay, I can take this because I can walk over to the Bank of Pennsylvania and I can convert it into gold if I want. But the fact of the matter is you probably don't want to, because you're not going to eat the gold. In fact, what you want to do is you want to convert that $10 that you sold the mule for into a pair of boots and some bread and fish for dinner and any other things that you want to buy. So you are likely to pass that on. And so these bank notes circulated essentially as money. Now, there was one bank that received a favored position. It was called the Bank of the United States. It was the only nationally chartered bank of the United States, and that was part of its favored position. The other part of its favored position was that it was the banker for the United States. So when the U.S. government collected taxes, when the U.S. government spent money on this and that, what did it use for a bank? It used the Bank of the United States. But the Bank of the United States and other banks were controversial. They were controversial in large part because in those days especially, to some degree this holds over until now, bankers were looked upon as kind of a suspect class because they were generally the most prosperous people in any community where there were banks, but they didn't seem to be doing any hard work. They didn't seem to be doing any work at all. You just give them money, and or they might lend you money and they charge you for the honor or the convenience of borrowing the money. So money went in, money went out, they got wealthy, and everybody always seemed to be owing money to banks. So Americans had this love-hate relationship with banks. But the reason they had love-hate relationships with banks was there just wasn't enough money to go around. There wasn't enough gold and silver, and the U.S. government, the Constitution had forbidden the states from issuing money, and the U.S. government wasn't issuing anything besides gold and silver until the Civil War. The Civil War placed enormous demands on the government of the United States of the Union. It did on the government of the Confederacy as well, and they did comparable things. So the government of the United States, in 1862, for the first time, issued paper money. Now, this paper money was of a special class called legal tender money. It meant that there was no promise on the part of the government of the United States to exchange these notes for gold. And furthermore, the legal tender part means that this money has to be accepted as payment for debts, ordinary debts. And so if I'm selling that mule and somebody offers me $10 on one of these legal tender notes, then all right, I got to accept it. It's just as good as money. Now, I have to accept it, but because everybody else has to accept it too, I'm willing enough to take it. Because again, people don't want money for the sake of money. It's only coin collectors that want that, or money collectors. No, people want money for what it can do, for what they can spend it for. And if I know that you're going to have to take my legal tender note, then I'm quite happy to take it because I can spend it on the bread and those boots and that other stuff. So the United States got in the business of issuing paper money. And these were called greenbacks because they were printed in green ink. And in fact, the term greenback is still something of a nickname, a slang term for the US dollar. So if you read the Wall Street Journal or read Fortune magazine, sometimes they'll talk about the greenback is up against the euro or something like that. Anyway, so these notes circulated as money, but they weren't exactly the same as money because they weren't gold and silver. And the great concern, and once again, the reason that people always like gold and silver in preference to things like paper was that, well, if the government can issue 1,000 legal tender notes, just run the printing press twice as long, you can issue 2,000, or instead of 1 million, they can issue 10 million of them. And that fundamental law in economics is that the more dollars get printed, the less each dollar is worth. And so people who have a pile of these legal tender notes, these greenbacks, worried that the government was going to print and print and print, and the value of their currency was going to go down and down and down. This had actually happened previously in American history during the American Revolution, before the Constitution, after the Declaration of Independence. The U.S. government, Congress, issued paper money called continental notes, the continental dollars. And they printed and printed because the finances of the government were in dire shape during the Revolutionary War. And they printed so many of these that the value went down and down and down until, by the end of the war, there was a phrase, not worth a continental, that meant that something wasn't worth anything at all. And people were left holding just armloads of these continental dollars that they couldn't get rid of. So Folks worried about this during the Civil War. And notice it's under the duress of war in both cases that these are issued. Now, in fact, the American Revolutionary government succumbed to the temptation to print more and more, and the Continental dollar became not worth a Continental. The Confederate government did the same thing. The Confederate government was losing, and it issued more and more until the Confederate dollars weren't worth anything either. The Union government, it helped that the Union won the war, but it still wasn't able to sustain the greenback at full parity with gold. Now, when I say gold, in fact, people didn't actually swap little pieces of gold or little bags of gold dust. They did that in California because of the gold rush, But what they really were swapping were gold dollars. Now, these were dollars that were backed by a promise to redeem them in gold if you delivered them to the U.S. Treasury. So there's this kind of first-class and second-class currency in the United States. They're the greenbacks and the gold dollars. And these would fluctuate in value one against the other, depending on how much confidence ordinary people had in the ability of the U.S. government to keep the greenback at a high level of value. And so speculators would get involved in betting on the price of one against the other, just the same way that money speculators today bet on where the dollar is going to be with respect to the euro or respect to the Chinese yuan or any other currency. And if they thought that the price of the dollar, if they thought that the greenback was going to strengthen, then they'd put their money in greenbacks. If they thought the greenback was going to down, they'd put their money on the gold dollars. And this led to all sorts of shenanigans, including a notorious attempt in 1869 to corner the gold market of the United States. It almost succeeded. If it had, then the government of the U.S., basically the American economy, would have been held hostage by the speculators who were behind this gold raid, as it was called. There were two guys named Jim Fisk and Jay Gould. It was broken at the last minute, but it was a kind of a close call. Anyway, all of this is by way of saying that the United States, until the 1870s, 1880s, could not solve its money problem. Once again, the money problem is, what is money? Who issues it? What is it worth? So by the 1870s, it was pretty clear that the government of the United States was the only one that issued actual money, although there were banks that were still issuing banknotes. But the government of the United States now was issuing two kinds of money. And there, again, were the greenbacks and the gold dollars. There was also the question of gold versus silver. There had always been a problem in this dual metal currency, gold and silver, because the price of gold and silver would vary one against the other. Anytime you have two commodities, two products, two, in this case, kinds of money, they're going to go up in value one against the other. And if you try to peg them, well, still, if a lot of silver is somehow, is suddenly dug out of the ground, then that's going to become more common and therefore less valuable. And people are not going to want silver dollars, they're going to want gold dollars. If there's more gold, then it's the converse. Now, as background to all of this, I have to mention the California Gold Rush. The California Gold Rush was prompted by the discovery of gold in California in 1848. And it led to the sudden peopling of California, but it also led to the injection of hundreds of millions of dollars, and that was back in the days when $100 million was worth a lot, hundreds of millions of dollars in gold into the American economy. Americans still strongly preferred gold, and all of a sudden, this big injection of gold made it possible for the American money supply to expand at a rate comparable to the growth of the American economy overall. It was an accident of geology and history that the American gold supply increased dramatically during this period, but without it, it would have been very difficult for the American Industrial Revolution to proceed as it did, because it would have been constrained by the tightness of the money supply. In any event, there had always been this problem between balancing gold against silver. And it got to the point where people wanted gold and they didn't want silver. And so once gold was discovered, gold became much more plentiful. And so people held on to their silver because silver was more valuable. And so people kept silver in their drawers and under their beds, and silver effectively went out of circulation, with the result that the United States was on a de facto gold standard. Well, this coincided with a decline in prices for farm goods. So wheat went down in value, corn went down, so corn, bushel of corn, the price for a bushel of corn fell by half between 1870 and 1890. For a bushel of wheat, it went down by 2/3, so comparable declines. And farmers were in dire straits because they had to pay off all these debts in the original amount, but they had to work very much harder to pay the debts. So they wanted more money. They wanted more money, just as the colonists had wanted paper money to increase the size of the money supply. So the farmers demanded more money, and the money that they wanted was silver. They wanted to bring silver back into circulation. And so in the 1880s, but especially in the 1890s, there was this campaign that used the slogan "Free Silver," which meant the free coinage of silver at a particular ratio of 16:1 of silver to gold. If this had been enacted, it would have meant a very large and sudden increase in the overall supply of money. It would have meant a rapid rise in prices. It would have reversed that decline in prices that farmers were suffering. So it would have been a great boon to farmers. Now, there is a saying in economics that there's no such thing as a free lunch. If farmers win because their debts are easier to repay, their creditors lose, because the creditors get paid back in dollars that are worth less than the dollars were before. So there became this basic split in the country between debtors, in particular farmers, and creditors, in particular bankers and manufacturers, people who lived in cities. And this money question, the money issue, was a principal, probably the principal issue in the presidential election campaign of 1896. William Jennings Bryan was the nominee of the Democratic Party and the Populist Party. They both agreed on William Jennings Bryan. And he campaigned for free silver. William McKinley was the nominee of the Republican Party. He said, no, we're not going to monetize silver. We're going to stick to gold. And so it was as close to an economic referendum as this country has ever had. It was the creditors on one side with McKinley and gold, and the debtors on the other side with Bryan and silver. Now, it was as close to an economic referendum, a monetary referendum, as we've ever had. It wasn't a perfect referendum. McKinley won the election. He didn't win entirely because he was the candidate of gold, but it's in the nature of elections, especially in presidential elections in this country, that if you win, then you claim support for everything that you advocated in the campaign. And so the 1896 election gave the victory to McKinley, who took it as a vote of confidence in gold and against silver. So the monetary question at that point had been decided in favor of gold, against silver, against paper currency. In fact, the McKinley administration made it official when the United States officially went on the gold standard and rejected silver in 1900. And that was, no, not the end of the story. That ended the debate for the moment. But in fact, the debate over money would continue into the 20th century. It continues into the 21st century. So almost nobody uses gold and silver anymore. In fact, it's illegal to own gold as private status. You can own jewelry, you can own bullion, but it doesn't circulate as coin money in the United States, and you haven't been able to do it since the 1930s. So Americans have gone off. The United States was still on an international gold standard from 1945 to the early 1970s, but even that fell apart because there just wasn't enough gold to go around. So we're hardly on even a paper money standard. Most of what happens in our money system these days is the transfer of digital zeros and ones representing dollars. So we effectively have an electronic money system. There is, of course, Bitcoin, which is this virtual money, and credit cards. Credit cards operate effectively as money, and cash doesn't change hands. we still have the same challenges. You know, what is money? Who's going to issue it? And how much is it worth? It's a problem that has been around as long as people have, since the first farmer traded some of his products to the first fisherman. He traded a sheaf of wheat for a fish. And it's going to be with us as long as anybody is in any kind of business at all.